The spring following Sophie Blackwell's death arrived in St. Mary's Village with the particular brilliance that characterizes the English countryside in the season of renewal, when dormant gardens burst forth into bloom, and the lengthening days seemed to promise a return to normalcy and the restoration of the social order that violence had temporarily disrupted. Miss Marple, observing from her cottage window the transformation of her own garden, from the grey starkness of winter into the vibrant profusion of spring flowers, found herself contemplating the manner in which natural cycles seem to operate with an indifference to human tragedy, and how communities, like gardens, possessed an inherent capacity to regenerate and flourish despite the traumas that afflicted them. It was during this season of renewal that an unexpected development occurred, one that would ultimately reveal that the investigation into Dr. Raymond Taft's crimes, while ostensibly concluded, had nevertheless failed to uncover certain dimensions of his criminality that would only become apparent through the intervention of circumstances entirely beyond the control of official investigation or Miss Marple's own observational acuity. The catalyst for this revelation came in the form of a letter addressed to Inspector Blackwell that arrived at the police station on a Tuesday morning in mid-April. A letter bearing a postmark from a prison facility in Yorkshire and containing information that suggested Dr. Taft had not acted in isolation in his various criminal enterprises, and that certain individuals within the community had possessed knowledge of his activities without having reported them to the appropriate authorities. The letter, written in a careful hand that bore evidence of considerable deliberation regarding its contents, was signed by a former inmate of the prison who had shared a cell with Dr. Taft and who had been released on parole some weeks prior, and who claimed that Taft had confessed to him details regarding his embezzlement scheme that suggested the involvement of at least one other individual who possessed financial knowledge sufficient to assist in concealing the misappropriation of funds from official scrutiny. This revelation prompted Inspector Blackwell to immediately contact Miss Marple and to request her assistance in identifying the potential accomplice, for while the letter provided certain financial details that seemed consistent with professional knowledge, it did not furnish sufficient information to identify the specific individual involved in Taft's schemes. Miss Marple, upon receiving the inspector's account of this development, experienced a sudden clarity regarding certain details that had troubled her throughout the investigation, details that she had dismissed as insignificant at the time, but which now, when examined in light of this new information, seemed to point with considerable directness toward an individual whose financial knowledge and professional position would have made them an ideal accomplice in Taft's embezzlement schemes. The individual in question was Mr. Harold Winters, the village's primary solicitor and financial advisor, a man of 65 years whose spotless reputation and decades of respectable service had placed him entirely beyond suspicion during the initial investigation, and whose involvement in Taft's crimes had been concealed by his careful maintenance of a facade of professional propriety and social respectability that had successfully withstood even Miss Marple's characteristically penetrating observation. The mechanism of Winter's involvement, when eventually uncovered through careful examination of financial records and the voluntary testimony of the prison inmate who had provided the initial information, revealed itself to be considerably more subtle and complex than Taft's crude embezzlement scheme. For Winters had not merely assisted Taft in concealing misappropriated funds, but had actually managed and invested those funds through legitimate channels, creating a veneer of financial legitimacy that made the embezzlement extraordinarily difficult to detect through conventional auditing procedures. Winters' motivation for assisting Taft in these criminal enterprises derived, upon investigation, from a combination of personal financial difficulty, resulting from unsuccessful speculative investments and a long-standing personal relationship with Taft that dated back to their university days. A relationship that had apparently created in Winters a sense of obligation and loyalty that had ultimately overcome his professional ethical standards and his legal responsibilities regarding financial fraud. The recognition of Winter's involvement in Taft's crimes produced in Miss Marple a complex emotional response, for she understood that while the justice system would proceed against Winters through appropriate legal channels, the revelation of his culpability would effectively destroy not merely his professional reputation, but his entire understanding of himself as a fundamentally respectable and ethical individual, and she recognized that in certain sense, the discovery of this betrayal constituted as significant a violation of the community's trust as Taft's original crimes had been. Inspector Blackwell, proceeding with appropriate official procedure, obtained a warrant for Harold Winter's arrest and secured his cooperation in providing testimony that would ultimately result in additional criminal charges against Dr. Taft relating to the scope and sophistication of his embezzlement scheme. Charges that would result in extended sentences and the recognition that Taft's criminality had been even more extensive and deliberate than initially understood. The community's response to the revelation of Winter's involvement was characterized by a peculiar mixture of shock and a certain grim vindication. For many villagers had harbored vague suspicions regarding Winter's financial judgment and his occasional lapses in professional discretion, and they experienced a certain satisfaction in the confirmation of these suspicions, though this satisfaction was tempered by the recognition that the revelation of Winter's betrayal reflected unfavorably upon the community's capacity to identify moral compromise in its midst. Miss Marple, observing these various reactions with her characteristic attention to the nuances of human response, found herself reflecting upon the manner in which communities often possessed within themselves the seeds of their own corruption, and how the capacity for ethical compromise existed not merely in obviously predatory individuals like Dr. Taft, but in ostensibly respectable people like Harold Winters, whose fall from respectability seemed in certain respects more tragic and more illuminating regarding the fragility of moral standards than the crimes of those who had never pretended to embody such standards in the first instance. Inspector Thomas Blackwell, a man of methodical temperament and considerable experience with the darker aspects of human nature, arrived at Thornfield Manor some 40 minutes after the initial telephone call, accompanied by 2 constables and a police photographer whose equipment clattered with purposeful efficiency as they ascended the narrow attic stairs. The inspector was not, as it happened, unrelated to the deceased. Henry Blackwell, Sophie's father, was a distant cousin through marriage, a fact that would later be noted in certain quarters as adding a layer of uncomfortable complexity to the investigation, though Inspector Blackwell carried himself with such studied professionalism that no one dared mention the connection aloud. What struck him immediately upon viewing the body was the precise manner of the killing. The leather cord, which he recognized as having been cut from one of the antique trunks stored in the attic, a detail he observed with the grim satisfaction of someone who appreciated the economy of a crime, had been applied with sufficient force to suggest either considerable physical strength or desperate determination, and there were no signs of struggle beyond a slight disturbance in the dust covering the trunk itself and a single hairpin, which lay several inches from Sophie's outstretched hand, suggesting she had perhaps been taken by surprise or worse, by someone she had not immediately feared. The coroner, Dr. Arthur Winters, who arrived within the hour, estimated death had occurred no more than 2 hours before discovery, which meant the killing had taken place sometime between 3 and 4 o'clock, during the very height of the garden party, when the house itself would have been largely empty save for the servants tidying the drawing room and the kitchen staff preparing the afternoon refreshments. This detail produced a peculiar tension among the assembled guests, who understood with the sudden clarity that violent crime brings that the murderer was almost certainly among them, that they had perhaps smiled at this person, offered them a plate of sandwiches, exchanged pleasantries about the weather while their hands harbored the capacity for such brutality. Miss Marple, who had remained in the garden throughout the commotion, observing the various reactions with her characteristic stillness, noted the precise moment when fear crystallized into something more dangerous, the moment when suspicion began to transform neighbors into potential killers. Inspector Blackwell, conducting his initial interviews in the drawing room of Thornfield Manor, found himself confronted with a curious unanimity of recollection regarding Sophie Blackwell's movements immediately prior to her death. Multiple witnesses recalled seeing her speaking with various individuals throughout the afternoon, with Victor Ashford at one point discussing what appeared to be an animated disagreement about local historical society matters, with Derek Hartley near the refreshment table, where they had stood together for several minutes in what struck observers as an unusually intimate conversation, and briefly with Dr. Taft, who had been discussing medical matters with her father when Sophie interrupted to ask if the doctor possessed any remedy for what she termed nervous complaints. No one, however, recalled seeing her leave the garden or venture toward the house, which immediately suggested either that she had slipped away unnoticed during a moment when attention was directed elsewhere, or, more troubling still, that someone had deliberately drawn her inside without others observing the departure. The inspector's questions became progressively more pointed, and the drawing-room air grew thick with the peculiar quality that arises when ordinary people are compelled to consider themselves as suspects. Catherine Hartley revealed, under gentle but insistent questioning, that her husband Michael had absented himself from the party for nearly 30 minutes during the middle of the afternoon, claiming to have received an urgent business call, though he could produce no evidence of this from the household telephone, which the servants confirmed had not been used during the relevant time frame. Victor Ashford, when pressed about his conversation with Sophie, became defensive and irritable, insisting that he had merely been discussing the historical restoration of the village church, and that Sophie's passionate opinions on the matter had seemed to him entirely appropriate for a young woman of her intelligence and education. Dr. Taft, for his part, admitted to having felt unaccountably fatigued and had retired to the library at approximately 3 o'clock to rest, having informed no one of his movements, and had remained there undisturbed until the discovery of the body sent the household into chaos. Derek Hartley, the discoverer of Sophie's body, found himself subjected to particularly intense scrutiny, given not only his role in discovering the corpse, but also his acknowledged acquaintance with the deceased through various social gatherings, and the fact that he appeared somewhat uncomfortable when questioned about the nature of his conversation with Sophie at the refreshment table. It was Derek who finally broke the increasing tension by asking, with an undertone of desperation, whether they were all to be treated as criminals, whether suspicion itself had become guilt in this new nightmare of accusation and counter-accusation. Inspector Blackwell, displaying the particular mercy that experienced police officers reserve for moments of genuine distress, permitted the guests to depart to their homes pending further inquiries, though not before taking detailed statements from each individual regarding their exact movements and observations throughout the afternoon. Miss Marple observed this process from her position in the corner of the drawing-room, where she had been invited to sit as a gesture of respect to her age and standing in the community, and as the various suspects filed past, she noted with her characteristic attention to detail the small betrayals that humans unconsciously commit. The way Catherine Hartley's hand trembled as she described her husband's absence, the subtle contempt that flickered across Victor Ashford's features when discussing a young woman he clearly regarded as beneath his social consideration, the relief that seemed to wash across Dr. Taft's face when the inspector finally dismissed him, and the genuine bewilderment that characterized Derek Hartley's responses, suggesting either innocence or truly formidable capacity for deception. The evening descended upon St. Mary's Village with the particular quality of darkness that follows autumn's early sunsets, and by the time the last of the official police activities had concluded at Thornfield Manor, the house had been sealed and the guests had dispersed to their various homes, carrying with them the peculiar burden of suspicion that attends any murder inquiry in a small community. Miss Marple, having been driven back to her own residence by the vicar's wife, found herself alone in her sitting room with a cup of cooling tea and the evening edition of the Village Gazette, which naturally contained not a word about the day's tragedy, the news having only occurred hours before press time, though the absence of such information felt almost conspiratorial in its silence. She settled into her familiar chair with her knitting, the needles resuming their rhythmic click with the automaticity of long practice, and allowed her mind to traverse the afternoon's events with the methodical precision that had served her so well over the years. What struck her most forcefully was not what had occurred, but rather what had been notably absent from the various accounts and observations. No one had mentioned seeing Sophie Blackwell with any particular intensity of emotion. No one had observed her in conversation with anyone who might have appeared threatening or dangerous, and most significantly, no one had remarked upon any prior indication that the girl's life was in any sort of immediate peril. This absence of warning, of premonition, of the small behavioral clues that typically preceded violence, suggested to Miss Marple's experienced mind that the murder had not been born of sudden rage or passionate disagreement, but rather of calculated necessity, of something that had required planning and resolution, which immediately elevated the crime from the realm of crime of passion into the far more deliberate category of premeditated violence. The following morning, Inspector Blackwell established what he termed a preliminary investigation headquarters in the village's modest police station, and it was there that the first genuine break in the case appeared to materialize, courtesy of one of the constables who had been conducting interviews with the household staff at Thornfield Manor. The servant girl, a young woman named Judith Merriweather, who worked in the capacity of upstairs maid, had volunteered the information that she had observed Mr. Michael Hartley leaving the library at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, which contradicted his stated timeline of his supposed business telephone call, and furthermore, she had noticed that his appearance upon emerging from the library had been somewhat disheveled, as though he had been engaged in more vigorous activity than merely taking a telephone call. When confronted with this discrepancy during a second interview, Michael Hartley's composure had fractured noticeably, and after considerable evasion and several false starts at explanation, he had finally admitted to having been in the library with Dr. Raymond Taft during the relevant time frame, though both men insisted with increasing vehemence that they had been engaged in nothing more sinister than a private discussion of a delicate financial matter that neither wished to have become public knowledge. This revelation produced a considerable commotion in the investigation, as it would have placed both men absent from general observation during a period that encompassed Sophie Blackwell's estimated time of death, and it further complicated the matter by introducing the question of what precisely constituted so sensitive a financial discussion that it required clandestine meetings at social gatherings. Miss Marple, learning of these developments through the efficient gossip network that existed in St. Mary's Village, a network that typically exceeded the speed of official police communication by a factor of approximately 3, found herself increasingly intrigued by the specific nature of the men's discussion. She made a point of calling upon her nephew's wife, who maintained a certain social connection to the Hartley family through county associations, and through a carefully orchestrated conversation involving the various merits of different types of knitting wool and the declining standards of village entertainment, she managed to extract the information that Michael Hartley's London-based accounting practice had experienced some difficulties in recent months, and that certain clients had been making inquiries regarding the status of their financial accounts. This casual revelation, delivered almost parenthetically in the midst of discussion about the vicar's wife's upcoming visit to her sister in Brighton, suggested to Miss Marple the outlines of a potential motive, though she refrained from sharing this observation with anyone, understanding that premature speculation often obscured rather than illuminated the path toward truth. The investigation entered its second day with an air of intensifying frustration, as Inspector Blackwell found himself confronted with an abundance of potential suspects, but a dearth of conclusive evidence tying any individual to the actual commission of the crime. The leather cord used in the strangulation had been identified as originating from one of the attic trunks, but given that at least a dozen people had moved through Thornfield Manor during the afternoon, and several of them had accessed the upper floors for various reasons, this evidence provided relatively little assistance in narrowing the field of suspects. The hairpin discovered near Sophie's hand had been identified as belonging to Catherine Hartley, who became considerably agitated upon learning this fact, and insisted that she must have lost it at some earlier point, that it certainly did not indicate her presence in the attic, and that such circumstantial evidence was precisely the sort of thing that could destroy innocent lives through mere coincidence and misunderstanding. Yet the presence of her hairpin, combined with her husband's proven absence from the garden during the critical time frame, created an uncomfortable suggestion of proximity to guilt, if not actual guilt itself, and the inspector found himself increasingly inclined toward the hypothesis that the Hartleys, perhaps acting in concert or perhaps independently of one another, harbored some motive sufficiently powerful to justify the eliminations of a young woman who seemed, on the surface of matters, to have had no particular connection to their lives or circumstances. It was on the morning of the third day following Sophie Blackwell's death that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor in the form of Inspector Blackwell himself, who arrived at her cottage with the slightly uncomfortable demeanor of a man who recognizes that he is about to seek assistance from someone whose unofficial methods exist in a decidedly ambiguous relationship with official procedure, yet who finds himself sufficiently stymied by conventional investigations that such assistance has become not merely desirable, but necessary. The inspector, settling himself into the comfortable chair that Miss Marple offered with her characteristic hospitality, explained that he had become aware through various channels of her reputation for understanding human nature and observing the minutiae of village life with an attention that often escaped the notice of professional investigators, and he wished, if she would be so inclined, to benefit from her observations regarding the various suspects in the case. Miss Marple listened to this request with a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth, understanding perfectly that what the inspector was truly asking was whether she had noticed anything that might guide his investigation toward a resolution, and she responded with her customary caution, suggesting that while she had indeed observed certain matters of interest, she would prefer to discuss these observations within the context of a more comprehensive understanding of the victim herself. For she had noted that the investigation thus far had focused primarily upon the circumstances of the death and the movements of potential suspects, but had devoted relatively little attention to the question of why anyone would have wished Sophie Blackwell dead in the first place. The inspector, somewhat defensively, noted that inquiries into Sophie's background had revealed her to be a perfectly ordinary young woman of unremarkable history. Well-educated, socially accomplished, and without any apparent entanglements of the romantic or financial variety that typically motivated murder in his experience, which was precisely why he found himself at an impasse, as the crime appeared to have been committed by someone, yet no clear motive had emerged to suggest who that someone might be. Miss Marple then posed a series of seemingly innocent questions regarding Sophie's activities in the weeks preceding her death, her social interactions, and any comments she might have made about the various adults in the village, and as the inspector responded to these inquiries, a peculiar pattern began to emerge that caused Miss Marple to set aside her knitting and focus her full attention upon her visitor's responses. She learned that Sophie had recently begun attending lectures at a private historical society that met monthly in the neighboring town, and that she had become something of a protégé to Victor Ashford, who served as the society's treasurer and had apparently taken considerable interest in the young woman's development as a student of local history. She further learned that Sophie had spent several afternoons in recent weeks at the home of Dr. Taft, ostensibly assisting him with the cataloguing of his personal library, a task that had seemed to occupy a disproportionate amount of the young woman's time, and that she had been observed in conversation with Michael Hartley on at least 2 occasions at the village market, conversations that had struck observers as unexpectedly animated for interactions between a young woman and a man of his years and station. Upon hearing this last detail, Miss Marple's expression shifted imperceptibly, though the inspector caught the subtle change and pressed for elaboration, which Miss Marple provided with characteristic circumspection, suggesting merely that she found it curious that a young woman of Sophie's apparent intelligence and social position would have engaged in repeated conversations with an individual whose marriage appeared, from outward appearances at least, to be considerably strained. The inspector, recognizing that he had been offered a thread to pull, departed Miss Marple's cottage with renewed purpose and a list of specific inquiries to pursue, and by that afternoon the investigation had taken a decidedly new direction, prompted by Inspector Blackwell's decision to examine more closely the nature of Michael Hartley's financial difficulties and the specific manner in which they intersected with the various relationships that had characterized his time in the village. What emerged from this renewed scrutiny was a curious chain of connections that suggested Sophie Blackwell had possessed knowledge of a significant financial impropriety involving one of Michael Hartley's major clients, a local industrialist named Sir Edward Pembroke, and that Sophie, in her capacity as an informal assistant to various village figures, had somehow acquired documentation relating to this impropriety, possibly through her work cataloguing Dr. Taft's library, which apparently contained correspondence between Hartley and Pembroke that touched upon matters of questionable legality. This revelation transformed the nature of the investigation entirely, suggesting that Sophie's death might not have been motivated by personal animosity or romantic complication, but rather by her possession of information that posed a significant threat to Michael Hartley's professional standing and potentially his freedom from legal prosecution. The second interview with Michael Hartley proved considerably more productive than the first, and though he initially continued to maintain his innocence regarding Sophie's death, the inspector's persistent questioning regarding his relationship with the girl, combined with the revelation that documentation of his financial impropriety had been recovered, eventually broke through his denials, and he admitted to having confronted Sophie in the attic of Thornfield Manor regarding the documents, though he insisted that he had merely wished to retrieve them peaceably, and that her death had been an accident, occurring when she had attempted to flee and had somehow become entangled with the leather cord that he had brought merely as a precaution, as a means of emphasizing the seriousness of the situation. Yet even as these admissions were recorded and Michael Hartley was taken into custody pending formal charges, Miss Marple found herself remaining unconvinced by the neat resolution that the investigation appeared to have reached, for there remained certain details that failed to align perfectly with Hartley's account, and she understood from long experience that such misalignments typically indicated the presence of a truth that had yet to be fully uncovered. The particulars that troubled Miss Marple's mind involved several small contradictions in the narrative that Michael Hartley had provided to the inspector, and while these discrepancies might have seemed insignificant to a less observant investigator, they possessed for her the quality of persistent irritants, small stones in the shoe of logical consistency that refused to be dislodged by conventional explanation. Most troubling was Hartley's account of the leather cord's origin, which he claimed to have taken from one of the attic trunks merely moments before his confrontation with Sophie. Yet the coroner's preliminary examination had suggested that the cord had been deliberately prepared for use, the ends having been carefully frayed and treated in a manner that suggested premeditation rather than spontaneous improvisation. Furthermore, the hairpin discovered near Sophie's body, which belonged to Catherine Hartley, remained unexplained in Hartley's account, and when pressed regarding this detail during his custody interview, he had simply stated that he did not know how the hairpin had come to be in the attic, which struck Miss Marple as precisely the sort of evasion that guilty individuals employed when they possessed knowledge they wished to conceal, but feared the consequences of direct admission. It was this observation that prompted Miss Marple to pay a somewhat unexpected social call upon Catherine Hartley at her village residence on the afternoon following her husband's arrest, bringing with her a small gift of homemade preserves and the ostensible purpose of ensuring that the woman was coping adequately with the shocking developments that had descended upon her family. Catherine Hartley received her visitor with a curious mixture of relief and apprehension, as though she had been anticipating some form of inquiry and had prepared herself for its arrival, and over tea served in a drawing-room that seemed to have absorbed something of the tension that characterized its mistress, Miss Marple engaged Catherine in a conversation that appeared to concern itself primarily with the various difficulties attendant upon maintaining a household during periods of domestic disruption, yet which gradually and almost imperceptibly shifted toward matters of more specific concern. She inquired, with apparent innocence, whether Catherine had experienced difficulty sleeping since her husband's arrest, and whether she had perhaps been wandering the house during nocturnal hours, a question that produced a sudden tenseness in her hostess's shoulders and a sharp, almost involuntary response suggesting that Miss Marple had touched upon some nerve of particular sensitivity. Miss Marple then proceeded to remark, in the manner of someone merely making conversational observation, that she had always found it curious how hairpins so frequently went missing from one's head during moments of emotional disturbance or physical exertion, and that she herself had once lost several while engaged in particularly vigorous spring cleaning, a comment that produced in Catherine Hartley a visible tremor of what appeared to be genuine distress. It was at this precise moment that Catherine Hartley's composure, which had been maintained with considerable effort throughout the preceding days, fractured entirely, and she began to speak in a hurried, almost desperate manner about matters that her husband had deliberately concealed from the official investigation. She revealed that on the afternoon of Sophie's death, she had herself been present in Thornfield Manor, having gone there at her husband's request to assist him in retrieving certain documents that he believed Sophie possessed, and that she had gone to the attic in search of the girl, having been directed there by one of the servants, and had discovered Sophie already dead, the leather cord still tight about her neck, and in her panic at this discovery, she had removed the cord, thinking somehow that this action might undo what had occurred, and it was during this desperate attempt that her hairpin had fallen from her hair to rest near the body. According to Catherine's account, she had then descended from the attic in considerable distress and had encountered her husband, to whom she had reported what she had discovered, and Michael had instructed her to remain silent about her presence in the house, assuring her that he would handle the matter, that he had not killed Sophie, but that his presence in the attic at the relevant time would only complicate matters unnecessarily, and that her silence was essential to his protection and the protection of their family. Catherine further explained that it was only after Michael's arrest that she had realized the implications of her silence, that by concealing her presence in the attic, she had allowed her husband to confess to a crime he might not have committed, and that she had come to understand that someone else must have been present in that attic. Someone who had deliberately ensured that Sophie Blackwell would not leave that space alive. And that person, she believed with increasing certainty, was someone whom Michael was attempting to shield through his false confession. This revelation prompted Miss Marple to immediately contact Inspector Blackwell and to insist upon a detailed re-examination of the attic space, paying particular attention to details that might have been overlooked in the initial investigation. And it was in response to this suggestion that the inspector discovered a crucial piece of evidence that had indeed been missed: a leather wallet belonging to Dr. Raymond Taft, tucked behind one of the attic beams, containing correspondence between Taft and Sophie that revealed the true nature of their relationship and the genuine reason for Sophie's presence in the attic on the afternoon of her death. The correspondence disclosed that Dr. Taft, who had been embezzling small but significant amounts from the estate of one of his elderly patients under the false pretext of medical expenses, had discovered that Sophie had learned of this impropriety and that she had threatened to report him to the authorities, and that he had therefore resolved to eliminate her as the only means of preserving both his professional standing and his freedom from prosecution. The discovery of Dr. Taft's wallet transformed the investigation from a case of apparent guilt into one of deliberate obstruction and misdirection, and Inspector Blackwell, recognizing that he had been operating under a fundamental misapprehension regarding the identity of Sophie Blackwell's murderer, moved with considerable urgency to secure a warrant for the arrest of Raymond Taft on suspicion of murder, a warrant that was executed on the morning of the 4th day following Sophie's death, when the doctor was apprehended at his residence attempting to pack several suitcases with what appeared to be the entirety of his portable possessions. Under formal interrogation, Taft initially maintained his innocence regarding Sophie's death, suggesting that his wallet must have been planted in the attic by some unknown party seeking to divert suspicion from themselves. Yet this defense crumbled rapidly when confronted with the detailed correspondence recovered from the wallet which bore indisputable evidence of Sophie's discovery of his financial impropriety and her explicit threat to report his crimes to both the authorities and to the medical board that oversaw his professional conduct. What then emerged was a confession of sorts, though Taft maintained that he had not intended to kill Sophie, that his only objective had been to frighten her into silence through intimidation, and that when she had attempted to flee from him in the attic, he had instinctively reached for the nearest implement, which had happened to be the leather cord, and that in his panic at her resistance, he had applied pressure that he had not realized would prove fatal, that he had not understood the fragility of human life, that he had not comprehended until too late that his actions would result in permanent and irreversible consequences. These protestations of accidental homicide were received with considerable skepticism by Inspector Blackwell, whose examination of the physical evidence suggested a degree of deliberation and control inconsistent with the narrative of panicked accident, and whose consultation with the coroner indicated that the application of the leather cord had required sustained and conscious effort to produce the degree of strangulation trauma evident upon Sophie's body. Yet what truly vindicated Miss Marple's skepticism regarding Michael Hartley's initial confession was her recognition that the entire sequence of events, when properly understood, revealed a pattern of calculated manipulation in which Dr. Taft had deliberately manipulated circumstances to ensure that suspicion would fall upon Michael Hartley rather than upon himself. That Taft had somehow become aware of Hartley's financial improprieties and had used this knowledge to engineer a situation in which Hartley would naturally be suspected of having committed a crime, of which Taft himself was guilty. The mechanism of this manipulation became clear through Miss Marple's gentle but persistent questioning of various parties, revealing that Dr. Taft had deliberately mentioned to Catherine Hartley at the garden party that he had observed her husband entering Thornfield Manor's library at an unusual time, a comment designed to plant the seed of suspicion regarding Michael's movements, and that Taft had further ensured that Sophie would be drawn to the attic by sending her a note purporting to come from Michael Hartley, and suggesting that important documents were stored there, a note that Sophie had apparently brought with her, and that had unfortunately been destroyed or mislaid during the chaos of her death. This recognition of Taft's deliberate engineering of circumstances prompted Miss Marple to reflect upon the nature of evil as it manifested itself in small communities. For what struck her most forcefully was not the passion or desperation that might motivate a sudden act of violence, but rather the cold calculation that Taft had demonstrated in his willingness to destroy not merely one innocent life, but potentially two. For Michael Hartley would certainly have faced serious legal consequences had the false confession proceeded toward trial. The implications of this realization prompted Miss Marple to request a final interview with Inspector Blackwell, during which she shared observations regarding aspects of Taft's behavior that suggested his crimes extended beyond the embezzlement that Sophie had discovered and the murder that had followed its threatened exposure. Her careful inquiry into the doctor's treatment of his elderly patient, whose estate had been the subject of the embezzlement, revealed that the patient had died under circumstances that had been accepted as natural causes, but that, upon re-examination, presented certain irregularities that might justify further investigation into the possibility of accelerated death through judicious medication or the withholding of necessary treatment. These suggestions, while ultimately requiring substantiation through official channels and expert medical testimony, indicated that Dr. Taft might have committed not merely the crimes that had been definitively established, but potentially others of even greater severity, and they underscored the manner in which seemingly respectable individuals could harbor within themselves the capacity for systematic violation of trust and the taking of human life, under circumstances that had escaped immediate detection precisely because such crimes appeared inconsistent with the perpetrator's established social position and professional standing. The arrest of Michael Hartley was formally withdrawn within 48 hours of Taft's apprehension, and while this development was received with considerable relief by the Hartley family, The experience had left Catherine and Michael profoundly altered in their understanding of village life and the darker currents that flowed beneath its placid surface. Currents that Miss Marple had long recognized as inherent to human community, regardless of its size or apparent tranquility. The formal investigation into Dr. Raymond Taft's affairs proceeded through the following weeks with the methodical precision that such matters demand. And what gradually emerged from the systematic examination of his financial records and medical files was a portrait of systematic criminality that extended considerably further than the immediate circumstances of Sophie Blackwell's murder or the embezzlement that had precipitated it. The inquiry into the death of Mrs. Eleanor Ashford's late husband, who had died approximately 18 months prior under circumstances that had been attributed to a prolonged heart condition, revealed that Dr. Taft had been administering medications in dosages that appeared inconsistent with standard medical practice for a patient of that particular age and health status, and while definitive proof of deliberately accelerated death remained elusive, the pattern of prescriptions and medical notes suggested a trajectory that pointed inexorably toward the conclusion that Taft had hastened the old man's demise, possibly motivated by financial arrangements or debts that the deceased had held over him. This revelation produced in Mrs. Eleanor Ashford a response of profound shock and distress, for she had regarded Dr. Taft as a trusted family physician and had never entertained the possibility that his care of her husband might have been motivated by anything other than professional concern, in the recognition that she had unknowingly been attended by her husband's murderer during his final weeks, produced in her a crisis of confidence that manifested in increasingly erratic behavior and a tendency toward paranoia regarding the motivations of those around her. It was in response to Mrs. Ashford's evident distress that Miss Marple made a point of calling upon her at Thornfield Manor on a grey afternoon when the garden that had hosted Sophie Blackwell's fatal garden party had begun its transformation into the dormant state characteristic of approaching winter, the flower beds stripped of their summer brightness, and the lawn beginning to show the first signs of browning that would characterize the season's deepening. Miss Marple found her hostess seated in the very conservatory where she had observed the garden party preparations weeks earlier, though now Mrs. Ashford's demeanor bore little resemblance to the purposeful social orchestration that had characterized her then, and instead she presented an appearance of diminished vitality, as though the revelation regarding Dr. Taft's probable culpability in her husband's death had somehow stripped from her the will that had sustained her through her initial grief. It was in response to Miss Marple's gentle inquiries that Mrs. Ashford began to articulate, hesitantly at first, and then with increasing urgency, a confession of sorts regarding her own awareness that her husband had been experiencing health difficulties that appeared to exceed what Dr. Taft's treatments might reasonably have addressed, and that she had, in moments of weakness born of exhaustion and grief, entertained thoughts regarding whether Dr. Taft's ministrations had perhaps hastened an end that would have come eventually in any case, and whether she might somehow bear responsibility for having engaged a physician whose competence or motivations she had never thoroughly examined. This revelation offered not as an accusation against Dr. Taft, but rather as a painful acknowledgment of her own complicity in a situation she had failed to recognize, struck Miss Marple with particular force, for it spoke to the manner in which guilt and responsibility in cases of murder extended often far beyond the individual who had wielded the weapon or administered the poison, encompassing instead entire communities and systems of trust that had allowed evil to flourish beneath a veneer of normalcy and professional respectability. It was this recognition that prompted Miss Marple to request a private audience with Inspector Blackwell, during which she shared her conviction that the investigation into Dr. Taft's crimes remained incomplete, that there existed within the community a broader pattern of victimization and exploitation that extended beyond the definable murders and financial crimes that had been formally identified, and that certain individuals within the village had likely experienced forms of harm or violation that they had perhaps not recognized as such because they had originated from a person whom they had been trained to regard as trustworthy and authoritative. The inspector, responding to these observations with the appropriate gravity that they commanded, authorized a more expansive investigation into Dr. Taft's professional conduct and personal relationships, an inquiry that ultimately revealed that several of his female patients had experienced inappropriate behavior of varying degrees of severity during medical consultations, behavior that had been accepted or dismissed at the time because of Taft's position and the inherent power imbalance that characterized the physician-patient relationship. These revelations, while not constituting criminal charges in the formal sense, painted a portrait of an individual whose moral universe had become progressively corrupted, whose capacity for manipulation and violation had extended across multiple dimensions of his life, and whose crimes of greater magnitude, embezzlement, murder, appeared less as aberrations from an otherwise respectable existence than as merely the most violent expressions of a character fundamentally compromised by selfishness and a complete absence of genuine regard for the well-being of others. The trial that followed in the subsequent months resulted in a conviction for murder in the first degree, with the evidence regarding embezzlement and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the death of Mrs. Ashford's husband being presented to provide context and motive rather than serving as independent charges, though the cumulative weight of this evidence influenced the judge's sentencing recommendation toward the maximum penalty available under the relevant statutes, ensuring that Dr. Raymond Taft would spend the remainder of his natural life confined within the prison system. The conclusion of the trial and the formal sentencing of Dr. Raymond Taft marked, in the estimation of most observers within St. Mary's Village, the effective termination of the extraordinary events that had descended upon their community in the weeks following Sophie Blackwell's murder. Yet Miss Marple, observing the various reactions of the villagers to these developments from her characteristic position of quiet observation, found herself entertaining certain reservations regarding the completeness of the resolution that had been achieved. What troubled her was not any doubt regarding Taft's guilt. The evidence of his culpability in Sophie's death and his embezzlement from his elderly patient had been conclusively established, but rather a lingering sense that certain aspects of the affair remained inadequately explained. Certain details that did not align with perfect precision into the narrative framework that had come to be accepted as definitive. Most particularly, Miss Marple remained perplexed by the question of how Dr. Taft had become aware of Sophie Blackwell's discovery of his embezzlement in the first instance, for while it had been established that Sophie had accessed certain documents during her work cataloging Dr. Taft's library, the mechanism by which Taft had learned of this discovery remained obscure, and the note that had purportedly drawn Sophie to the attic on the afternoon of her death had never been recovered or definitively authenticated. These small uncertainties, while perhaps insufficiently significant to warrant reopening the investigation in any formal sense, nevertheless tugged at Miss Marple's consciousness with the persistent quality of an unfinished piece of needlework, and it was this nagging incompleteness that prompted her to accept an invitation to take tea with Victor Ashford at his residence some weeks following Taft's sentencing. Victor Ashford, Mrs. Eleanor's brother-in-law, had maintained a somewhat peripheral role throughout the investigation, though his initial interviews with Inspector Blackwell had established that he had been present at Thornfield Manor on the afternoon of Sophie's death, and had been observed in conversation with the victim regarding matters of historical interest. Over tea served in a drawing-room that bore the masculine aesthetic of a widower's long-established bachelorhood, Miss Marple engaged Victor in seemingly innocuous conversation regarding the village's historical society and the various projects that occupied the organization's attention. A conversational approach that gradually shifted toward the specific matter of Sophie Blackwell's involvement with the society and the nature of her intellectual development under Victor's tutelage. It was in response to these apparently casual inquiries that Victor Ashford's carefully maintained composure began to show signs of strain, and he eventually revealed, with evident reluctance, that Sophie had indeed become something of a protégé to him, and that he had invested considerable time and effort in cultivating her intellectual development. and that he had perhaps entertained certain expectations regarding the reciprocation of the emotional investment that he had made in her education and personal growth. This admission, offered with the painful self-awareness of someone acknowledging the pathetic nature of his own delusions, suggested to Miss Marple the outlines of a more complicated emotional landscape than had previously been apparent, and she pressed gently but persistently regarding the specific nature of Victor's disappointment when Sophie had apparently not fulfilled these unspoken expectations. What emerged from this careful questioning was the revelation that Victor had discovered Sophie in conversation with Dr. Taft on at least 2 occasions, and that he had interpreted these conversations as evidence that Sophie was directing her intellectual and personal attentions toward Taft rather than maintaining her exclusive allegiance to Victor as her intellectual mentor, and that in his wounded pride and jealous rage at this perceived betrayal, he had mentioned to Dr. Taft, in what he claimed was a casual aside, that Sophie had been asking questions about Taft's financial arrangements and his relationship with his elderly patients. Victor further confessed that he had not recognized the significance of his comment at the time, had not understood that he might be providing Taft with warning regarding Sophie's suspicions, and that the realization of his own probable complicity in Sophie's death, however inadvertent, had haunted him throughout the subsequent weeks with a weight of guilt that had become nearly unbearable. This revelation, while not constituting any actionable criminal offense on Victor's part, nevertheless illuminated for Miss Marple the manner in which communities of ostensibly civilized individuals contained within them layers of unexamined emotion and unconscious cruelty, the way in which personal disappointments and injured pride could translate into actions with devastating consequences for others. It was in response to Victor's evident distress at this recognition that Miss Marple offered what comfort she could, suggesting gently that while he had indeed spoken carelessly, and that this carelessness had contributed to circumstances that had resulted in tragedy, he had not possessed knowledge of the consequences that would follow, and that the burden of responsibility for Sophie's death belonged entirely to the individual who had chosen to commit murder, not to those whose inadvertent actions had merely provided opportunity or motivation. This observation, delivered with the particular wisdom that Miss Marple had accumulated through decades of observing human weakness and moral complexity, appeared to offer Victor some small measure of consolation, though it was clear that the weight of guilt he carried would remain with him for the remainder of his natural life, a silent monument to the consequences of allowing wounded vanity to override the restraint and discretion that civilized intercourse demands. As Miss Marple departed Victor's residence and returned to her own cottage in the gathering dusk of an autumn evening, she reflected upon the manner in which the investigation into Sophie Blackwell's death had revealed not merely a single instance of human evil in the form of Dr. Taft's calculated murder, but rather a more complex web of human weakness, disappointed expectations, and the unconscious cruelties that emerge when individuals fail to examine their own motivations and emotions with adequate honesty and self-awareness. The passage of time following the formal conclusion of the investigation into Dr. Raymond Taft's crimes proceeded with the particular quality that characterizes small communities in the aftermath of significant disruption, wherein the extraordinary gradually yields to the ordinary through a process of collective forgetting and deliberate avoidance of those subjects that have produced communal distress. The leaves fell from the trees that lined St. Mary's village lanes, were gathered into neat piles by industrious residents and subsequently burned in garden bonfires, whose smoke carried with it the scent of autumn and, for many observers, the lingering remnants of the turbulence that had characterized recent weeks. Winter descended upon the village with its customary severity. Snow accumulated upon the slate roofs of the cottages and manor houses, and the rhythms of village life returned to patterns that had existed long before Sophie Blackwell's death, and would presumably continue long after the memory of that tragedy had faded into historical anecdote. Yet for Miss Marple, the conclusion of the formal investigation and the sentencing of Dr. Taft did not represent a genuine resolution, but rather merely the conclusion of one chapter in a longer narrative regarding the nature of human community and the complex interplay of forces that shaped the moral landscape in which even the most seemingly placid of villages existed. It was this recognition that prompted her, on an afternoon in early December when frost had rendered the landscape crystalline and brittle, to request a final interview with Inspector Blackwell, during which she shared certain observations that had continued to trouble her regarding the investigation's ultimate conclusions and the manner in which certain aspects of the affair had been resolved, perhaps too expeditiously, to constitute a genuinely complete understanding of all that had transpired. The inspector, receiving these observations with the patience that Miss Marple's years of accurate insights had earned for her, listened as she articulated her conviction that, while the investigation had successfully identified and secured the conviction of Sophie Blackwell's direct murderer, it had not adequately examined the broader systemic failures that had permitted Dr. Taft's crimes to flourish for such an extended period without detection or intervention. Most particularly, Miss Marple drew the inspector's attention to the manner in which Taft's position as a trusted medical professional and respected member of the community had created a context of unquestioned authority that had allowed him to exploit both his patients and his professional standing without meaningful oversight or accountability. She further observed that the various individuals who might have noticed irregularities in his behavior or questioned his treatment decisions, colleagues, staff members, even family acquaintances, had been prevented from doing so by a combination of professional deference and social reticence, and that this pattern of institutional silence had effectively created a protective environment within which serious crimes could be perpetrated with minimal risk of detection. These observations, while not constituting any formal complaint against the inspector's handling of the investigation, nevertheless prompted a broader examination within official channels of the systems of accountability that existed for medical practitioners and other professional individuals who occupied positions of particular trust and authority. The result of this examination was a series of recommendations regarding enhanced oversight procedures and the establishment of more systematic mechanisms for investigating complaints against medical professionals. Recommendations that, while not directly addressing the tragedy that had befallen Sophie Blackwell, nevertheless represented an attempt to prevent similar crimes from occurring in future circumstances. It was in the context of these broader systemic examinations that Miss Marple found herself invited to address a gathering of village leaders, constabulary officials, and concerned citizens regarding her observations regarding the investigation and her thoughts regarding the manner in which communities might better protect themselves against predatory individuals who exploited positions of trust and authority. Her remarks, delivered in the gentle but uncompromising manner that characterized her public statements, emphasized the necessity of maintaining vigilance regarding the behavior of those to whom authority had been granted, and the importance of resisting the natural human tendency to defer to established hierarchies and to accept uncritically the actions of those who occupied positions of professional or social prestige. She spoke particularly of the responsibility that all members of a community bore in questioning behavior that appeared inconsistent with professional norms or ethical standards, and she noted that the reluctance to voice such questions, born often from fear of social disapproval or concern regarding the potential consequences of challenging established authority, ultimately resulted in a community climate in which serious abuse could flourish undetected. These remarks, while received with respectful attention by the assembled gathering, appeared to Miss Marple to produce a somewhat defensive reaction from certain quarters, as though her emphasis upon communal responsibility for systemic failures had been interpreted as criticism of individuals or institutions rather than as an attempt to articulate principles of collective accountability that transcended any single case or circumstance. Yet this apparent defensiveness did not diminish Miss Marple's conviction regarding the validity of her observations, and she departed the gathering with a sense that, while the formal investigation into Sophie Blackwell's murder had been concluded and its perpetrator punished, the broader work of examining and reforming the systems that had permitted such crimes to occur remained very much incomplete. The recognition of this incompleteness, rather than producing in Miss Marple any sense of frustration or futility, instead reinforced her long-held conviction that the pursuit of justice in human communities was not a matter that admitted of clean conclusions or definitive resolutions, but rather constituted an ongoing process, requiring perpetual vigilance, sustained moral attention, and a willingness to acknowledge and confront uncomfortable truths regarding human nature and the fragility of the institutional safeguards upon which civilized society depended. The winter months that followed the public airing of Miss Marple's observations regarding systemic accountability proceeded with a certain quietness that characterized the season itself, the village settling into routines of domestic warmth and familiar social patterns that seemed deliberately designed to exclude contemplation of anything beyond the immediate concerns of hearth and home. Miss Marple, ensconced in her cottage with her knitting and her correspondence, received occasional visits from various parties connected to the investigation, visits that bore the quality of pilgrimage, as though individuals sought in her presence some form of absolution or clarification regarding their own roles in the tragedy that had befallen Sophie Blackwell. Henry Blackwell, Sophie's father, called upon her in late December, bringing with him the manuscript of a historical account of the village that Sophie had been compiling at the time of her death, and he requested Miss Marple's assistance in determining whether the work should be completed and published as a memorial to his daughter, or whether such publication might constitute an unseemly exploitation of her memory for purposes of historical record. Miss Marple, examining the manuscript with her characteristic attention to detail, recognized in Sophie's careful observations and precise documentation evidence of an intellectual maturity and commitment to truth that transcended mere scholarly exercise. And she advised Mr. Blackwell that the publication of his daughter's work would constitute not a dishonoring of her memory, but rather a continuation of the intellectual project to which she had devoted her final months of life. This suggestion prompted Henry Blackwell to proceed with the work's publication in the following spring, in the resulting volume, dedicated to Sophie's memory and bearing the title The Hidden History of St. Mary's Village, became recognized as a significant contribution to local historical scholarship, a contribution that would have delighted Sophie had she lived to see it reach completion and recognition. Catherine Hartley, liberated by her husband's exoneration from the suspicion that had initially attached itself to him, found herself confronted with the necessity of reconstructing her marriage and her life in the aftermath of the trauma that the investigation had produced, and she sought Miss Marple's counsel regarding the psychological and practical dimensions of this reconstruction. Miss Marple, responding to these inquiries with the gentle wisdom that experience and observation had conferred upon her, suggested that, while the investigation had revealed certain strains and weaknesses in the Hartley marriage that could not be ignored, it had also provided an opportunity for genuine reckoning and renewal, provided that both parties approached such renewal with honesty and commitment to addressing the underlying issues that had contributed to the marriage's difficulties. The Hartleys, following this advice, subsequently engaged in an extended period of careful communication and mutual examination, work that ultimately resulted in a transformed relationship characterized by greater authenticity and mutual understanding than had previously existed, a transformation that would have been impossible without the catalyst of crisis that the investigation had provided. Victor Ashford, bearing the weight of his recognition regarding his own complicity in the circumstances that had led to Sophie's death, gradually withdrew from his various social and community roles and eventually relocated to a smaller residence in a neighboring town, where he devoted himself to historical research and scholarly pursuits that seemed to offer him a form of redemption through the pursuit of objective truth and the careful documentation of village history. Inspector Blackwell, in the months following the investigation's conclusion, implemented several of the systemic reforms that Miss Marple's observations had prompted, including enhanced oversight procedures for medical practitioners and the establishment of mechanisms for investigating complaints regarding professional conduct, reforms that, while modest in scope, nevertheless represented a recognition of the necessity of vigilance regarding those who occupied positions of trust and authority. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, having confronted the revelation regarding Dr. Taft's probable involvement in her husband's death, and having worked through the complex emotions that such revelation had produced, eventually returned to something approximating her former social engagement. Though the experience had stripped from her the certainty and confidence that had previously characterized her approach to community affairs. As the first anniversary of Sophie Blackwell's death approached, the village of St. Mary's organized a memorial service in the churchyard, a gathering that brought together the various parties connected to the investigation and the crime. And Miss Marple attended this service with the solemnity that the occasion demanded, observing as the various mourners processed past Sophie's grave, bearing flowers and expressions of remembrance. It was following this service, as Miss Marple stood alone at the graveside after the assembled mourners had departed, that she allowed herself to reflect upon the investigation and its consequences with a candor that she typically reserved for her own private contemplation. She recognized that Sophie Blackwell's death had not altered the fundamental nature of human community or eliminated the capacity for predatory behavior that existed within even the most respectable individuals, but rather had served as a reminder of the necessity of perpetual vigilance and the importance of questioning authority when such questioning was warranted by observable evidence of wrongdoing. She further recognized that the investigation had revealed not merely a single instance of crime, but rather a broader pattern of human weakness and moral compromise that implicated numerous individuals and institutional systems in ways that admitted of no easy resolution or definitive closure. Yet she also recognized that within the aftermath of tragedy lay the possibility of genuine learning and transformation, that communities, like individuals, possessed the capacity to examine their failures and to implement reforms that, while unable to undo past harm, might nevertheless prevent similar harm from occurring in future circumstances. As Miss Marple departed the churchyard and returned to her cottage through the winter afternoon, she carried with her the quiet satisfaction that came from having worked through a complex mystery to its ultimate resolution, and the deeper recognition that such resolutions, while important in their practical consequences, represented merely moments of temporary clarity in an ongoing human struggle to create communities characterized by justice, accountability, and genuine concern for the welfare of all who inhabited them, a struggle that would require the sustained attention and moral vigilance of thoughtful individuals throughout all the days and seasons yet to come.